Strange Shadows, a Clark Ashton Smith podcast.
Greetings folks, and welcome to a very special edition of Strange Shadows, the Clark Ashton Smith podcast. I'm your host Tim Mendes. I'm alone today, alone with a dusty tome by the name of Dawnward Spire Lonely Hill Volume 2 from Hippocampus, and this is the letters of H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith. Now, long-term listeners will have heard me, no doubt, mention a certain, what's the word, brouhaha that occurred in the pages of the Fantasy Fan. It's become known as the Boiling Point fiasco. Now, this is basically, I like to think of it as a precursor to a modern-day flame war. You know, where basically people, it happens every time somebody adapts a sci-fi book for TV, right? You get people turning up on both sides saying, oh, this is crap, or no, it's not, it's awesome, you lot should die, you know. And while this is a lot more polite than that, it is very much of the same kind of thing. The Boiling Point controversy kicked off in September of 1933 in the pages of the Fantasy Fan, which was, as you would imagine, it's a fanzine that was basically contemporaneous of Weird Tales and Wonder Stories and all these kind of things, and basically it was for fans, and there was stories published in it and all that kind of stuff, but in the letters pages people discussed works that appeared in other magazines, so it was very much a fan thing. It was kind of, think of it now as kind of like your fan groups on Facebook. That's kind of how it was, but a lot more highbrow, you know what I mean? After the publication of Smith's Dweller in the Martian Depths, or Dweller in the Gulf, as it is better known. Now, the story was botched by the publication, Wonder Stories, with many changes being forced on it, but we'll get to that in due course. That'll be in Season 4. Just keep that in mind, though, as a certain participant in the drama drops a not-so-subtle hint about this fact. The Boiling Point was a letters section where people would essentially bicker. It was designed for people to have debates, as it was put. Now, what I'll do is I'll actually read you the magazine's description of the Boiling Point, so you can see where it's coming from, right? Only the hottest of controversies will be printed in this column. Radical arguments that will bring your blood to the boiling point. But like I say, it all kicked off in September 1933 when Forrest J. Ackerman, who was a long-time sci-fi fan, he was also a brief correspondent of H.P. Lovecraft's and a writer in his own right, he took to his typewriter and thrashed out a scathing piece about Clark Ashton Smith's story and weird fiction in general. And it went by the title, A Quarrel with Clark Ashton Smith. So here we go, I'm going to read you the opening salvo. I have to say, it seems to me that Wonder Stories is going far afield when it takes such a horror story as Mr. Smith's Dweller in the Martian Depths, and because it is laid on the red planet, prints it in a magazine of scientific fiction. Frankly, I could not find one redeeming feature about the story. Of course, everything doesn't have to have a moral. The thrilling science film, King Kong for instance, has no moral to it, except perhaps to be careful of Fay Ray if you were a giant prehistoric ape. But it has a point, at least, to interest. And Dweller in the Martian Depths didn't interest me. I don't know, maybe it did others, but it disappointed me very greatly to find it in a science fiction publication. In Weird Tales, all right. I don't like that type of story. I wouldn't read it there. I fail to find anything worthwhile in an endless procession of ethereal lights, fantastic visions, ultra-mundane life, exotic paradises, airy vegetation, whispering flutes, ghastly plants, and dirge-like horrors. May the ink dry up in the pen from which they flow, or at least Mr. Smith direct those tales elsewhere, not to a science fiction publication, because I do like your science fiction, like The Master of the Asteroid and Flight into Supertime, but stuff like The Light from Beyond, Ugh. There you go, yeah. Not very nice, is it, you know? If you don't like it, you don't like it. You don't have to bang on about it, right? This is something that annoys me about the modern world, so it's quite reassuring to see it was happening back in 1933. So at the end of the section, the editor of The Boiling Point basically said if anybody wants to retort, then they should do so, and actually said, "Your replies will be published in this department. We would especially appreciate a reply from Mr. Smith himself in defence of his stories." He didn't have to wait long. The next month, October 1933, the whole debacle continued. Now, the first letter printed in The Boiling Point of October 1933 was another one by Forrest J. Ackerman, who followed up on his letter because of the editor saying, "Come on then, I want to hear from other people." He decided to get in first, right? "You will remember the terrific outburst Forrest J. Ackerman made upon Clark Ashton Smith's stories and weird tales in general in last month's column. Shortly after the issue went to press, we received the following postscript to his article, which he requested to have printed in the beginning of this month's column. I could as well pick on John Taine, a favourite author, mind you, for the time stream in Wonder Stories, another story considered doubtful science fiction. My only interest is to keep science fiction in the science fiction publications and let fantasies and weird tales appear in the magazines featuring that type. It is to be hoped that Mr. Smith will discover many of his admirers through the writings of readers caring to present arguments." So, yeah, basically doubling down. But we didn't have to wait long. Just under that, we had a retort from Clark Ashton Smith himself. He calls his defence horror, fantasy, and science. Mr. Ackerman's fervent and ebullient denunciation of my stories, followed by Editor Hornig's invitation to join the melee, is not to be resisted. I infer that Forrest J. Ackerman considers horror, weirdness, and unearthliness beyond the bounds of science or science fiction. Since horror and weirdness are integral elements of life, as it is well known to those who have delved beneath the surface, and since, in all likelihood, the major portion of the universe is quite unearthly, I fail to understand the process of logic or syllogism by which he has arrived at this truly amazing prescription. Let me recommend to Mr. Ackerman and to others like him a more scientifically open and receptive attitude of imagination. If Mr. Ackerman were transported to some alien world, I fear he would find the reality far more incredible, bizarre, grotesque, fantastic, horrific, and impossible than any of my stories. In regard to the light from beyond, I cannot see that this tale is any more fantastic and unreal than others dealing with unknown dimensions or planes of hyperspace. Physical entry into such planes is improbable, but form an alluring theme for fiction or speculation. It is curious that Mr. Ackerman should profess to like Flight into Supertime, a story which is wilder, if anything, than those he has denounced. I might also add that it was written as a satire on time travelling and should not have been read too seriously. Of course, it is Forrest Ackerman's privilege to dislike my stories and to express his dislike whenever he chooses. I've merely tried to point out that he is in error when he condemns them as being inherently unsuitable for a science fiction magazine. Yeah, there you go. And this is something that Rob and I have talked about a lot. The Smith really goes for that, the weird, because he's right, isn't he? You know, you land on an alien planet, it's going to be, by its very nature, it's going to be alien. It's not going to be like Forrest J. Ackerman's study, you know. There's going to be weird plant life and things like that. And the fact that he brought up that he didn't like the weird plant life and stuff like that, I find really strange. Now, the next letter, very next letter, is by somebody who will be very familiar from our regular listeners. It's Mr. H.P. Lovecraft, who couldn't resist getting in on it. As for Ackerman's ebullition, I fear he can hardly be taken seriously in matters involving the criticism of imaginative fiction. Smith's story was really splendid, except for the cheap ending on which the editor of Wonder Stories insisted. There we go. Ackerman once wrote me a letter with a very childish attack on my work. He evidently enjoys verbal pyrotechnics for their own sake and seems so callous to imaginative impressions. Yeah, this is what I mentioned at the top. Yeah, so apparently the ending was changed by the editor, and much to H.P. Lovecraft's chagrin by the looks of it. Now, the very next letter is another well-known voice. It's August Derleth. August Derleth liked everything in the Fantasy Fan except the letters in this department from Forrest J. Ackerman, who, he says, while unusually quite interesting, nevertheless has the unpleasant habit of trying to make everything over into his own image. Right, so I don't know a lot about Forrest J. Ackerman, but it sounds like he's one of those chaps who has an opinion and only his opinion is valid. You know, we all meet them down the pub, right? Our next letter is from R.H. Barlow, another writer and member of the Lovecraft Circle. To my mind, you are deplorably lacking in imagination to so condemn some of the finest work of the greatest living fantasy writer. Must you be so literal, physical, in your interpretation of imaginative literature? Clark Ashton Smith, who I have the honour of knowing, is primarily and foremost a poet, his work having received the highest commendation of such persons as Edwin Markham, George Sterling, etc. Truly, his colourfully nightmarish visions are far superior to the conventional type of, forgive me, trash, printed in the average mercenary science fiction magazine. The mere fact that a few helpless ray projectors, heroine consisting mainly of lipstick and legs, and dastardly villain are not dragged in by the nape of their respective necks certainly does nothing to impair the excellence of his dulcet prose, but rather is an agreeable relief. Now, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love this line from Barlow here. The mere fact that a few helpless ray projector heroine consisting mainly of lipstick and legs and a dastardly villain. That is a really quite succinct summation of a lot of science fiction of the time, isn't it? You know, it's one of those things. It's like the covers, if you think of the artwork, right? It is mainly heroines consisting of lipstick and legs with a ray gun, you know. Yeah, well done, Mr. Barlow, well done. Okay, in the November 1933 issue, it continues. They describe it as waxing hot. The first letter is from Robert Nelson, who I've been able to dig up no information about. I don't know anything about Robert Nelson. If any of our listeners do, please let me know. The Ackerman-Smith controversy assumes all the aspects of a mad comedy. To assail and reprehend the writings of Clark Ashton Smith is as preposterous and futile as a dwarf transporting a huge mountain peak upon the tip of his tiny finger. Either Forrest J. Ackerman is daft, or an imbecile, or a notoriety-seeking clown and knave. Clark Ashton Smith stands alone in the realm of present-day weird and fantastic literature, and therefore, above all his contemporaries, he is still king and has yet to be dethroned. Hear, hear, Mr. Nelson, yes, I couldn't agree more. I love that. This is what I'm liking about this whole thing. There's some great turns of phrase, you know, and it's all very polite, isn't it? It's not degenerated into your mama at all. You know how it goes nowadays, right? When people get into a quote-unquote debate, it degenerates into personal insults very, very quickly. There is a little bit of that, but it's still very polite, you know what I mean? Wading into the fray next, we have Richard E. Morse, who was a poet, a librarian, and a correspondent of H.P. Lovecraft's. Not so much in rebuttal to Mr. Ackerman as to toss another stick onto the fire. Let me confess that the scientific fiction type of literature seems to me among the dullest written. I avoid wherever possible, except in such cases where it passes the boundaries into the weird and horrible. Of course, the work of Wells is an exception. This may be blasphemy to most of your readers, but there it is. To return to Mr. Ackerman's complaint, I fail to see why it is any more deplorable for Wonder Stories to publish Clark Ashton Smith's horror than for Weird Tales to publish Edmund Hamilton's pseudo-scientific effusions. and it was Amazing Stories that had the honour to publish The Colour Out of Space by America's master of the weird, Lovecraft. That's a very good point he makes there. Ackerman doesn't seem to have a problem with science fiction cropping up in other magazines. It's one of those things. It's kind of like we see it with, I think Lord of the Rings is a great example. When fandom basically thinks they own it, that fan ownership thing, which is really destructive. So when anybody ever does an adaptation or a take on something, it's all like, they're all up in arms because it's not their vision. And I guess this is kind of the Ackerman problem here, right? I mean, that's how I see it anyway. Moving into December, the Ackerman-Smith debate is still going strong. We actually get a couple of we get some people piling on Ackerman's side here, which is interesting. The first one comes from an Alan Glasser. I'm surprised at the vicious remarks being made about Forrest Ackerman. He really doesn't deserve any such abuse. Perhaps his writings are a bit flamboyant and over-enthusiastic, but surely that's no great fault. To those who know him well, Forrest is a fine fellow, and his zeal for science fiction merits praise rather than censure. Well, that's fair enough, but he started it, right? Donald Alexander is another one who piles in on Ackerman's side. I've been watching the controversy in the boiling point. It seems to me that young Forrest J. Ackerman is by far the most sensible of the lot. Instead of intelligently answering his arguments, Messrs. Smith, Lovecraft, Barlow, etc. have made fools of themselves, descending to personalities. Ackerman is a most interesting type of crank. Everyone who writes into a magazine is a crank, so am I. At least Forrest J. Ackerman shows signs of a rudimentary intelligence, which most cranks don't. I agree with him, The Light from Beyond and several other Smith yarns had no place in Wonder Stories. Wonder Stories calls itself a science fiction magazine. Smith's story under discussion isn't science fiction, so it had no place in such a magazine. Forrest J. Ackerman is right. I see no reason why Lovecraft should condemn Ackerman for not liking Smith. After all, we each have our own tastes. Smith, in my own opinion, is a poor writer. His stories are all like the ravings of some fearfully diseased mind. Lovecraft, on the other hand, is a fairly good writer, but I'm wasting good typewriter ink. Your readers haven't enough intelligence to grasp such a common-sense argument as the one presented by Ackerman, so they call him a nitwit. Well, he actually has more sense than the lot of them thrown together. If there were 100 million Forrest J. Ackermans in the world, it'd be a better place to live in. At least we'd have a little common sense used occasionally. Now, steady on there. It was all, quite reasonable and balanced there, wasn't it? Until I'm wasting good typewriter ink. Your readers haven't enough intelligence to grasp such common sense argument. Yeah, all right. You've kind of shot yourself in the foot there, because he starts off by kicking off about the fact that Smith and Lovecraft and Barlow descended into personalities. So, and he's done exactly the same thing, but attacked the entire reader base. So yeah, well done, Mr. Alexander. The editor actually wades in at this point, after the printing of that letter. Now, while we are very glad to find defences on the Ackerman side, we must disagree with Mr. Alexander when he calls our readers too ignorant to grasp an argument put forth by Mr. Ackerman. Their eager disapproval with logical objections contradicts this theory, and then again, the mere fact that they are science fiction and weird fans puts them above average, for such readers must be broad-minded and open-minded, and not the "what's good enough for father is good enough for me," or "there ain't no such animal" types. We believe that this letter leaves cause for rebuttal on the part of Messrs. Smith and Lovecraft. Now, of course, Forrest Ackerman doesn't like the way he's been presented here, so he wades in again. Pardon me, but why did you run the boiling point in a foreign language? What a vocabulary on those weird men, Smith and Lovecraft. And I think I'll have to change my tag from Forrest J. Ackerman, scientifictionist, to Forrest J. Ackerman, ebullitionist. The two got the word in within the first line of comments. Now, Mr. Smith will be calling Mr. Lovecraft plagiarist, and then maybe Mr. Smith, the Skylark, will burst in and say that he owns the original. Let's have a contest. Just thought of it. The original Paul illustration that I treasure would be from Smith's story, The City of the Singing Flame. I don't get the connection. The Lovecraft says in print a very childish attack, and in his personal reply to me, your bright and candid letter. Yeah, so he's decided to descend into mockery here, which is fair enough. I think he's trying to make light of it, but you can tell he's cheesed off, can't you? There's quite a bit of venom behind his words there. Now, we get a few other people wading in. We get letters from William Crawford, who is the editor of Unusual Stories. And I just want to read you this one now from F. Lee Baldwin, who is another member of the Lovecraft Circle. What does this Ackerman guy know about weird and fantastic fiction? From the way he writes, he must be an unimaginative person unable to stretch his mind away from spaceships and foreign star clusters. I get that he is an egotistical radical, and one who doesn't like something that is not even intended for him. So far, in telling about his collection, he is described as a sort of madhouse. However, I would like to see this madhouse, as I can appreciate a thing or two that is connected with scientific fiction. At heart, I am truly a weird and fantastic fiction fan. Yes, me too, sir. Me too. Hear, hear. So we move on to January 1934 now, and so basically this has been going on for 5 months already, right? And we get another rebuttal from Mr. Ackerman. Since the pros and cons of my Boiling Point article have changed around to discussions of character, I wish to state that I do not like H.P. Lovecraft's attitude. I was interested in his closing sentence in the second issue, and also in Mr. Derleth's. They were both interesting to analyse, but I resent Mr. Lovecraft's further uncalled for remarks. If I am not qualified to judge any weird tales, he is not qualified to call names. It seems to me of late that his palsy-walsy Clark Ashton Smith has been turning out an overabundant amount of literature, but goodness, I don't think the man's egotistic and attempting to draw attention to himself. The man likes to write, and so do I. Yet Mr. Lovecraft says of me, peculiarly ridiculous, because I make absurd comments to focus people's eyes on me, and write voluminously for the same reason. I take it, but I don't keep a scrapbook. That's not very consistent with the nature described, is it? And ask Mr. Hornig what my answer was when he proposed a Forrest J. Ackerman issue of the Fantasy Fan. What a puffing up I should have gotten, had I been that sort of person. You tell him, Charles, what I said. No. Not that I see what difference it makes who writes articles and how many of them are in one issue, as long as they're good, which I hope mine are, but people will talk, and so I'm not obliging with an autobiography of myself for the famous Fantasy Fans feature either. Furthermore, Mr. Lovecraft, you seem to have forgotten something. I keep my letters from famous writers. You say I once wrote you a very childish attack on your work, but your answer to that letter was, I am very pleased to get your bright and candid letter this morning. I write these paragraphs in my behalf because, being more of a Weird Fans magazine, I can't expect many voices on my side from the Fantasy Fan readers. If you will see the third paragraph in the letter of C. Ferry and B. Rogers in the December Wonder Stories, however, you will find that the gentlemen are 3 times over as vehement and acidic as I. You might call them unknowing supporters. To Robert Nelson, who says I must be daft or an imbecile or a notoriety-seeking clown and knave, I can only answer that I thought it was a foregone conclusion that Fantasy Fans were daft anyway, and that examination of the ratings of the members of my alma mater graduating class might prove differently about the second statement, and that I think I have cleared of the third already. Richard E. Morse's letter has impressed me as the only one that really says something. His thought had not occurred to me before, and it is worthwhile considering Weird Tales allows science fiction. Why not Wonder Stories' Weird Tales? As the science fiction fan, I am always eager to see scientific fiction in Weird Tales and any other magazine. I see that the process can easily be reversed, so Mr. Morse has me there. The argument is settled. Well, if only that was so. Mr. Lovecraft retaliates in this letter as well. Glad you are giving the vociferous Mr. Ackerman a hearing. It's always well to let both sides of a debate have an equal chance. but I fear that F.J. the Terrible and his allies don't make out a very strong case. The tirade to which exception was taken was not merely an ascension that Mr. Smith's Dweller in the Martian Depths is unsuited for a science fiction magazine, it was a wholly gratuitous and intemperate attack on the story itself, written with a slapdash extravagance and obviously sadistic gusto, which plainly showed either a complete lack of analytical understanding and imaginative sensitiveness, or, as it was probable, a mere boyish desire to show off and attract notice. However, Ackerman is young, as proved by his tendency to regard ordinary civilized language as alien and incomprehensible. Now that he's had a good barrage from the general public, it would be just as well to leave him in peace. 5 years from now, he'll go beyond any of us in laughing at his explosions of today. Now, this is an interesting letter here from William H. Dallenbach, who was a science fiction writer, and this is really kind of balanced, and it's really good points the man brings up here. I'm not a weird man. Indeed, I've read very few weird stories that I have considered really good. Therefore, this is not so much a defence of Smith, who I believe is absolutely wrong in trying to link weird fiction with science fiction, as a rebuttal to Ackerman. However, first let me say that I think you are making a mistake, editor, in publishing and readers in writing letters which make too personal remarks. Aside from the fact that they are not true, the boiling point is for arguing about principles and not for calling antagonists names. But on with the dance. Forrest says that Dweller in the Martian Depths and The Light from Beyond should not have been published in Wonder Stories. He also calls the time stream doubtful material for a science fiction publication. Point 1. In regard to Forrest's dislike of Smith's excessive vocabulary, I will say that this is purely a matter of personal opinion, and I respect his opinion, which is more than do Messrs. Lovecraft, Barlow and Nelson, even though I don't agree with him. As a change from the average run of science fiction stories, I enjoy Smith's wonderful language. I believe I've read very few stories as beautifully told as The Light from Beyond, and though I don't like his weird stories, nevertheless his manner of telling them seems admirably fitted to weird fiction. Again, I couldn't agree more. Smith's language is something that really raises his work above and beyond 90% of other writers, you know what I mean? Point 2. I heartily agree with Mr. Crawford. Science fiction would indeed be dull if it consisted of nothing but the ideas Mr. Ackerman lists. Fantasy is an integral part of science fiction, and while the 3 above mentioned stories were for the large part fantasy, they also contained the elements of strict science fiction. Point 3. Finally, if no other explaining will suffice, I can only offer this last fact. Such stories provide variety, and there are many who will like them, so if you don't, Forrest, just forget about them. Science fiction cannot be composed of all interplanetarians or all medical or any other type. Yeah, I think he's hit the nail on the head. I think he's hit the nail squarely on the head there. And yeah, basically at the end of the January section, the editor printed this little notice. We hereby give notice that the Smith-Ackerman debate will be concluded in the February issue. It has just about run its course. If you have anything to say, you'd better say it now. It's your last chance. In the next month's column, Clark Ashton Smith presents a rebuttal to the vociferous letter of Dr. Alexander's in our December issue. Mr. Smith is glad to know that Ackerman is being given an even break. We hope that this friendly argument has been well taken by all concerned and will cause no hard feelings. No, I'm not sure. The thing is, I have seen plenty of mention of Ackerman from Lovecraft, and yeah, he seems to have got Lovecraft all ruffled up, which is quite amusing. So on to February 1934 and the conclusion of the Boiling Point fiasco. And as promised, the first letter is from Clark Ashton Smith. Donald Alexander's letter caused me to reread carefully my own answer to Forrest Ackerman's epistolary critique. Since my one concern was to meet Mr. Ackerman's arguments on their own ground, I am puzzled by the assertion of Mr. Alexander that I've made a fool of myself by descending to personalities. Offhand, I should have said that my letter was about as free of that sort of thing as it could conceivably have been. Perhaps there are a few mildly ironic touches, but certainly nothing of an invidious nature was implied or even intended. I do not think that any good purpose is ever served by abusive personalities. If my letter was derogatively personal, I really wonder how Mr. Alexander's should be classified, which is exactly what I said, right? When he goes on to say that all the readers are basically a bunch of idiots and all the rest of it. It's just like, yeah, you kind of shot yourself in the foot there, pal. At this point, the editor, H. Koenig, jumps in with an amusing little aside here. He suggests that we missed a golden opportunity by not supplying the debaters with gloves and entering them in the Golden Gloves contest in Madison Square Garden. This has got to be the reason that Lovecraft and Barlow wrote The Battle that Ended the Century, right? There's got to be why. Our next one is a reply from Robert Nelson. When you shout pertaining to Smith's stories, may the ink dry up in the pen from which they flow, you affect the refined and sensitive minds of the admirers of beautiful things, and cause them to exclaim, here indeed is one who endeavours to do something in words as terrible as in actuality. Cleave the head of a genius in twain. Hence our fitting denunciation of you, Mr. Ackerman, for attempting to backbite one of the greatest writers America has ever produced. One great thing that's coming out of this is we're getting to hear what a lot of people thought about Smith, and it must have been quite nice for Smith, because you know what it's like. He'd spent a lot of time getting things rejected and all this, so it's nice to hear from people who are like defending him and saying that his work is as awesome as it is, you know. So that must have been a nice feeling, even if it was in the midst of this complete nonsense, you know what I mean? Next up, we have one of Lovecraft's collaborators, one of the people Lovecraft wrote with, and that's Dwayne Rimmel. When some well-meaning person says that Ackerman has more sense than Smith and Lovecraft combined, he's just being ridiculous. If Clark Ashton Smith has a diseased mind, as Mr. Alexander states, I would for one like to be exposed to the germ. Yeah, me too. Me too. Next up, August Derleth reappears. The Ackerman-Smith debate amuses me. Of course, I'm squarely on Smith's side, and don't understand why you publish the more puerile of the letters on the matter. Next up, we have F. Lee Baldwin popping up. The whole argument was caused by Ackerman claiming that Smith's Dweller in the Martian Depths should not have appeared in Wonder Stories. Smith should have sent the story to Weird Tales, thus avoiding a clash with Ackerman, who, I take it, has no use for weird literature. Or the editor of Wonder Stories should have foreseen some catastrophe and promptly returned it to Clark Ashton Smith, who I esteem very highly, by the way. Yeah, I like the sarcasm there. It's just like, yeah. Basically, because they didn't do what Mr. Ackerman liked, you know, which is the whole point, you know. And that pretty much brings the whole debacle to a close. There was a lot of like reader letters as well, but they're not printed in this, which is unfortunate because I've had a look, but a lot of them were just kind of like, you know, not as well balanced and basically just rehashed points that the other people made. And it ends with this. We stated last month that the Smith-Ackerman debate would end in this issue, and so it has. Many of our readers have started to get bored with it, and more than that, some ill feeling has been aroused. We go further to state that there will be no more department known as the boiling point. The name implies that everything contained therein should be boiling hot, and these boiling hot arguments, as we have found out, create an unpleasant atmosphere for many concerned. The fantasy fan is attempting to bind the lovers of science and weird fiction together tighter with friendship, and not to separate them through dislike of each other's ideas. However, to take the place of the boiling point, we are starting a new department next month entitled Your Views. This will not contain any debates, but the opinions of you, the readers, on various subjects which we will nominate. So write into us immediately answering the following questions. What is there in the horror story as associated with weird and fantastic fiction? Is there any virtue to them? How can they be defined? How can they be defended when people will read them and say that they are distasteful to the well and normal mind? Why does a person wish to read a sinister tale of evil or monstrosities? Is it healthy reading? Is it not morbid? Forrest J. Ackerman has suggested this subject. Let's see what you think. Oh, I absolutely love that. The editor must have been grinning to himself here. He writes out this whole piece saying, yeah, this whole thing basically killed off the boiling point because it just got too much. So he decided to do this other section, Your Views, and where they would discuss a topic. And the first topic he chose was one by Forrest J. Ackerman, basically about the same thing. So yeah, so there you go. I'll have to delve into issues of the Fantasy Fan and see if anything more crops up in the next bits, because I can imagine, you know what people are like? People are like dogs with bones when they get their teeth into a subject, right? Well, there you go. I thoroughly enjoyed going through that. There were some very amusing bits and some very good points raised, actually. So, yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this little... I could think of it as a supplemental. Yeah. And we will see you again in a couple of weeks with, I believe we're doing a special episode on Auburn. So that'll be something to look forward to. And with that, it's good night from me, Tim Mendes. Thank you very much.